thanks so much for having me. Just a little trigger warning right at the end of the talk. I talk about COVID-19 pandemic and loss during the pandemic, so if that's a topic that affects you, just so that you're aware, in case you want to leave it all, just to be aware about it. So I recently conducted a collaborative research project with the University of York and English Heritage, which sought to understand why historic graffiti matter and whether understanding graffiti creation today can help us to better understand mark making in the past. So graffiti has a plurality of meanings that can and have been applied to a variety of vastly different mark making practices. For many, it encompasses unauthorised marks which have been written, painted, scribbled or sprayed onto a wall or surface, largely found in urban settings, whereas others apply it to marks that have been scratched, etched and applied to walls going back to the prehistoric and ancient past. Ralph has described graffiti as a continuation of landscape marking practices that have been used by humans for at least 40,000 years, and an important source of material evidence which archaeologists can use to learn about cultural identities and ideas. However, common definitions of the term largely allude to the contemporary understanding, framing these marks through vandalistic connotations, as illegal or illicit, and as a threat to property. Graffiti is also been defined through its connection to public space, an idea which can be applied to contemporary and historic marks. Baird and Taylor describe how graffiti appeared on the walls of buildings in ancient times, but in both public and private spaces. And many researchers have traced the genealogy of modern graffiti back to cave paintings and graffiti of the ancient Egyptians, Greeks and Romans, Maya civilization and the Vikings. As an artefact and cultural practice, graffiti has been a topic of archaeological inquiry for over a century, particularly regarding classical marks. And the term graffiti is rooted in archaeological practice, originally devised as an archaeological term, and first known to have been used by the leading Italian archaeologist Francesco Avellino in 1841, who published his remarks in the Real Accademia Ercolonesi in an essay on ancient graffiti, where he described the small scratch writings that were found in excavations of Roman ruins in Pompeii and Rome, and the term was later adopted by later antiquarians. Graffiti is believed to have been derived from the Italian word graffiti, little scratchings, and derived from the verb graffiare, to scratch, and ultimately from the Greek graphene, to scratch, draw, or write. Just as these marks do today, ancient graffiti formed part of the built environment of cities such as Pompeii, marking sites of social interaction. Consequently, it can be argued that the definitions and understandings of graffiti depend not only on the marks themselves, but on the context of the built environment that these marks inhabit and societal relationships within these spaces. In contrast to its contemporary usage, Fleming has noted that in early modern England as elsewhere, there was no term to actually denote graffiti text and differentiate it from other forms of writing, stating that this was a fact not to suggest that the vice was unknown, but that the activity was not distinguished from other writing practices and not yet considered a vice. Similarly, Cody has explained how in the 18th century, marks were left in public spaces long before they were viewed as a form of social misbehaviour, whilst Paling has described how during this period graffiti was done by many and remarked on by few. Furthermore, Daniel has argued that the further back in time we apply modern understandings, such as those centred around illegality and the concepts of ownership, the more unstable the definition becomes, as historic marks were created under different legal, political and social circumstances. Even now, the definitional understandings of graffiti are complex. It's increasingly understood as a form of public art in recent decades, thus it can be understood as part of a lineage of wall-based communication and creativity. Ashanti White has argued that graffiti is an integral art form which embodies aesthetic truth and feeling of the artist, community and society, whilst Frederick and Clark have written that graffiti can be an act of defiance that operates as a transgressive and interventionist force in contemporary society. So taking a transhistorical approach, we can see that graffiti has a plurality of meanings which may not always agree with one another, and that term can be applied to both marks made before the term existed and to modern marks where the mark maker is aware of their position as a graffiti writer or artist or graffitist. In an attempt to define graffiti or get at what it is, we may actually discover that just as graffiti has been used as a form of resistance, the term itself resists being defined and controlled, as it continually adapts to and is reliant on the social, geographic and temporal positions. Instead, the term may always be in a state of flux, and one which we have to be accepting of a lucid or open etymological framework. And this combined universality and fluidity has been described by Lovato and Alden as both its strength and weakness. So when it comes to graffiti, we can accept multiple, sometimes competing definitions, as this allows each individual or community to understand the term based on their own positioning, but situated within a loose framework. However, something which is easier to agree on is that the desire to leave one's mark on the environment and landscape around us exists across time around the globe. Artists have been making their marks on the world around them for tens of thousands of years, from cave art to the Upper Paleolithic to contemporary graffiti. Lohmann has described how leaving one's mark on the wall seems to reflect a desire as old as humankind, and for Tacon and Chippendale, mark-making is a characteristically human trait and one of the ways that we socialise landscapes. Although particular areas and communities may have their own styles or typologies, graffiti and wider wall writing is not confined to one place or period. And so if we look at the often minute details described onto historic surfaces, how does this open up avenues for new investigations into the historic record? If we examine marks left by individuals who have physically scratched the surface of historic structures and consider their intentionality by doing so, rather than viewing such marks with a lens of vandalism, as is often the case within the heritage sector, how does this open up the potential to include underrepresented stories? Despite these marks often being found in plain sight, as they've been scratched, etched, written or drawn onto historic structures and monuments over centuries, many of these histories remain hidden because they haven't previously been valued as an historic resource. Yet examining them opens up new lines of inquiry and reveals a mark-making tradition and practice that spans at least centuries, if not millennia. Throughout history, graffiti has also shown that it can be used to defy traditional social boundaries, as these marks can be left by anyone. Andrew Hann, a senior property historian at English Heritage, has described how these marks enable us to gain a greater insight into the history of ordinary people who have left their mark on the world around them. For example, in their research into the late 19th and early 20th century farm buildings in the Yorkshire Wolds, Katie Melanie Giles described how graffiti can record aspects of life that would not be found in official records and would otherwise have remained unrecorded. Consequently, the examination of graffiti offers researchers opportunities to discover untold stories and reveal more about the lives of those who are often ignored or forgotten by dominant historic narratives. These voices from history, exhibited on the marks left behind and found on surviving walls, can provide an insight into the various lives that operated in these different built environments and reveal visual traces of the past. However, if someone graffitied a monument or listed building today, this would be considered a heritage crime. But MacDonald has written that a few centuries ago it was considered a popular thing to do, as many tourists visiting cultural and historic sites left their marks. And Daniels further argued that the Victorians and others carved their names onto monuments. The fact that they carved their names onto monuments is indicative that they felt safe enough they wouldn't be pursued or punished. However, during the 19th century, there was an increased focus on the preservation of heritage sites and national heritage management practices were introduced, such as the Ancient Monuments Protection Act of 1882. So this growing heritageisation in the late 19th and early 20th centuries meant that these sites were designated heritage assets and as heritage sites and reframed as heritage assets with an increased focus on preservation and conservation. As the context of these places changed, so too did the ways in which people were supposed to interact with them. Expected performances with heritage shifted. Within this context, a destructive act like graffiti can be viewed as the antithesis of the preservation attitudes of heritage discourse and management. However, when viewed within this historical context of mark-making, it's not that people's desire to leave marks is new, it's arguably part of a traditional heritage practice itself, but that the context of these places has changed, leading to such acts being reframed as vandalism. During the late 19th century, the defacing of Stonehenge by tourists and antiquarians who chipped at the stones to create souvenirs or scratched their names into monoliths was commonplace. But it increasingly began to be highlighted as an issue. One visitor in 1871 complained that the constant chipping of stone broke the solitude of the place. And today, such an action would constitute damage to a scheduled monument. But graffiti is arguably just about as much about its context as it is about its content, and trying to understand its context is crucial. So in 2024, Just Stop Oil calls for all when they launched a protest at Stonehenge and sprayed 3 of the prehistoric standing stones with an orange powder made of corn flour to draw attention to their campaign. Many criticised the protesters for potentially damaging the stones, though the protest was designed to be temporary. Archaeologist Sarah Kerr wrote afterwards that the backlash demonstrates how heritage sites such as Stonehenge hold a sacred place for many and generate an almost desperate desire for rigid preservation. But Stonehenge and its landscape are dynamic features that forever shift and change. And this was not the first time that stones have been used as a site of protest. In 1961, the slogan "Ban the Bomb" was graffitied across 9 stones by members of the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament, CND. Meanwhile, past mark-making interactions inform part of the interpretation of the site, with some crediting I. Wren on stone 52 to the 17th and 15th century architect Sir Christopher Wren. Whilst this historic mark is now valued for its historical and evidential significance, both examples of protest work were largely critiqued at their time of creation. As just discussed, historic graffiti is increasingly being recognised for its significance and for how such marks can help us to better understand how individuals from the past interacted with place and landscape. The graffiti in Richmond Castle's 19th century cell block is arguably one of the most famous examples of a collection of historic graffiti in England and a rare example of graffiti conservation. 2,300 graffiti were recorded as part of the Richmond Castle cell block project between 2016 and 2019. And the collection of the cell block graffiti reflects its different uses over time and chronicle the preoccupations and experiences of those who left their marks for around 100 years. Most famously, this includes conscientious objectors, COs, who were detained in the cells for disobeying orders when Richmond Castle was used as the northern base for the non-combatant corps during the First World War. The CO's inscriptions are now viewed as a unique and remarkable record of First World War conscientious objection in the UK. They're both a collection of voices, but also deeply personal and an insight into their inner thoughts, memories and beliefs of those detained in the cells, inscribed onto the outside world for later occupants and posterity. Delicate portraits of loved ones can be found alongside bold political and religious statements, as well as biblical hymns, drawings, pastoral scenes and tallies for games. This includes this drawing of Annie Wainwright, the fiancée of the imprisoned conscientious objector John Hubert Brocklesby, a depiction of Jesus alongside an extract from the Gospel of John, "Because I live, thou shalt live also." Norman Gowdy's mother, who's a CO, created by another CO, Bert Brocklesby, and graffiti from a socialist conscientious objector Richard Lewis Barry, who wrote, might try as well to dry a floor by throwing water on it as to try to end this war by fighting." Many of the COs were upstanding members of their communities before the outbreak of the First World War, but faced hostility as they held on to their religious beliefs and political convictions during the war. Though the graffiti in the cell block are most renowned for being a unique insight into First War conscientious objection, the building also contains hundreds of marks made by Second World War soldiers. However, the graffiti made in the early years of the Second World War showed that the cell block was not only a place of detention for unruly soldiers, but was also a recreational and arguably creative and reflective space with evidence of games, drawings, illustrations, names, places and dates written onto its walls. The earliest example of Second World War graffiti in the cell block was created by Edward Donaldson Badger, known as Badger, of the Green Howards Regiment, who left his graffiti on the same day that Britain declared war on Germany, the 3rd of September 1939. And Badger is the most prolific mark maker in the cell block, having left at least 28 examples in the building, including multiple marks from September 1939. There are also a few examples of remembrance and memorialisation which can be found in the cell block. This includes Violet Grey, 20th of August 1936, ever to be remembered, in memory of dear old Baggy, Descent, 5th, RIP 1949, and Gone But Not Forgotten. Perhaps the most interesting example of remembrance graffiti in the cell block is a mark left by 9 members of the Royal Court of Signals, dated to 1940. And 2 of the men who wrote their names on the list are known to have died during the Second World War. Frederick Bradley, who was born in 1920, died on the 11th of October 1944 in the Kinseki prisoner of war camp in Taiwan, and Lance Corporal Sidney Moore, who was born in 1911, was killed in action on the 27th of May 1940 during the Battle of France, only 1 month after writing his name on the walls of the cell block. Like many of the graffiti in the cells, this piece arguably serves as a form of self-memorialisation for for the men who left their mark but were subsequently killed during armed conflict. Consequently, their graffiti persists as a tangible record of their existence, and even as a form of self-memorial. Whilst many of the cell block graffiti are not explicitly memorial in nature, the building arguably functions as a tomb and sacred space, containing a record of the hardships endured by the COs, including numerous prayers, beliefs and convictions written on its walls, and the devastating consequences of war experienced by both the COs and soldiers, despite some of their optimism, as the latter marked onto the cell block. Within this space, graffiti's palimpsest also functions as a metaphor for the laying of history, with thousands of voices represented onto the cell block over time. By treating each mark as an artefact and all graffiti within the cell block as a collection, this provides an insight into the inner thoughts and beliefs of those who've interacted with the building over time, including their religious and political convictions, memories of loved ones at home, evidence of their creativity, their perceptions of the world, and their desire to preserve a sense of themselves by marking these intangible feelings and views, by making these intangible feelings and views tangible, by inscribing them onto the cell block itself. So moving on to another historic example, an English heritage site, Kirby Hall in Northamptonshire is one of the great Elizabethan houses of England. It was built by Sir Humphrey Stafford in 1570 and then completed by Sir Christopher Hatton, one of Queen Elizabeth I's favourite courtiers. During the 18th century it became less occupied by its owners and was largely abandoned to fall into ruin in the 19th century. Between 2021 and 2022, I conducted a graffiti survey of Kirby Hall, recording and photographing all marks which could be found in the accessible indoor and outdoor areas. I expected to find a few hundred. I ended up finding 2,500 graffiti that were recorded as part of this process, and they've provided a further insight into the history of Kirby Hall, but not of its owners or its building campaigns, but new stories of staff and visitors over centuries of its history that had previously been otherwise unknown or undiscussed. This includes the story of William Bennett and Lacey Colbert Richards, both born in 1860 in the nearby town of Oundle, who would have been aged 20 when they left their graffiti at Kirby. William worked in various painting roles throughout his life, and Lacey started working as a tailor, but later became a master tailor, and also a member of the Freemasons. When visiting in 1880, they left their mark behind, seemingly as a way of commemorating their visit, functioning similar to taking a memento away. They left something about themselves behind, embedding themselves into Kirby Hall's history. Furthermore, with the passing of time within a historic setting, their mementos have become mementos mori, to remind us of the inevitability of death and the brevity of life. As through their permanence, these tangible physical markers serve as reminders of the transient nature of life. Hundreds of graffiti are also found in the attic, left by individuals visiting the middle of the 19th century onwards. The dating marks in the space indicate that visitors were able to access the attic in the 19th century, before this seemingly stopped and only restarted again in the mid-20th century. Furthermore, many of the 20th century graffiti in the attic were left by apprentices in the 1970s and 80s who used the space for breaks. These marks can be viewed as an illegal act under the Criminal Damage Act of 1971 and as a heritage crime, but despite this they have heritage value as a form of social history. We can then consider how will the historic value of contemporary graffiti, which is still left in heritage sites today, increase with the passage of time, and how will such marks, if they're not lost, be received in future decades and centuries. Having looked at a variety of examples of graffiti within historic settings, I then used similar methods to try to better understand contemporary graffiti practices through an archaeological lens. In 2022, I examined 3 spaces in Greater Manchester and West Yorkshire using phenomenological and walking as method approaches to see how graffiti can differ depending on type of place, and then examined these spaces again 2 years later to see how these graffiti landscapes have changed over time. The resulting data showed that all sites reflected the often ephemeral nature of graffiti in a multitude of different ways. For example, in the village of Slowett, located in an industrial rural area in West Yorkshire, graffiti was buffed away or naturally faded over time, with these becoming graffiti ghosts. The Fallowfield Loop is a disused railway line in Manchester, which has been converted into a cycle path popular with commuters and those using it for recreational purposes. It's also a site wealthy with artistic creation, home to tags, throw-up pieces and everyday graffiti on signs, railings, lamppost bridges and underpasses. In another example of graffiti ephemerality, many of the pieces were covered up as other graffitists sought canvases for their works. Despite this, traces of some of the old works can still be found underneath. And in another example from the northern quarter in the city of Manchester, an area containing a fervour of graffiti activity. Unsurprisingly, as an urban space, there's a lot of evidence of commercial street art, such as this example from the jewellers, an advert for the jewellers Pandora and then for the yogurt Muller Corner. As an advert here, the ephemerality of the work depends on how long the space has been hired for. So though ephemerality is a key aspect of contemporary graffiti, historic graffiti demonstrates that it can have a sense of permanence or intended permanence, which only further adds to the complexity of the term. The findings from this work also highlighted how graffiti can be idealised as a purely countercultural, creative or anti-capitalistic act, which may be a discourse or reaction to its modern association with vandalism and criminality. However, this framing can obscure a broad reality that graffiti is an act of the everyday, can reflect a plethora of social discourses, including those which resist and those which reinforce dominant power structures. As graffiti offers a public platform for expression, often under the cover of anonymity, the same qualities that make it empowering and resistant form of expression, used as a way to highlight social inequalities or foster community solidarity, can also make it susceptible to appropriation by pernicious voices. For example, progressive messages found across the walks, including charity appeals, call for political or community action, and criticisms of austerity, were juxtaposed with conspiratorial, nationalistic or far-right expressions. And these contrasting examples demonstrate how graffiti can serve as a platform for progressive and regressive messages within public space, reinforcing that graffiti can be used to broadcast objectionable ideologies or reinforce existing social power dynamics. So furthermore, looking at other contemporary examples of graffiti in non-formalised heritage settings, this can reveal even further complexities about understanding of graffiti. So the final examples I'm going to share are those made during and in reaction to the recent COVID-19 pandemic. And during the pandemic, particularly in the first few months, graffiti became inextricably linked to the period, as it functioned as a visual language and representation of COVID-19, when imagery of the effect of the virus on individuals was too difficult to bear. It also reflected a wide variety of voices within pandemic public discourse, including sharing positivity, echoing official healthcare messages, protesting inequalities, and the dissemination of mistruths and conspiracy theories. Following the onset of the pandemic, many graffiti and street artists began to incorporate pandemic references into their works, venturing out into quiet and empty streets during lockdown to create coronavirus murals and provide vibrant, thought-provoking, amusing commentary on the crisis. In response to the pandemic, the environments we inhabited changed in comparison to pre-pandemic times, whilst also fluctuating and altering throughout. During this time, graffiti and street artists used their skills as public communicators to physically represent unprecedented times, whilst there was also an increase in the use of public mark-making practices by those who would not necessarily identify as graffitists. And these pandemic-related marks contributed to our visual understanding of COVID-19, with graffiti and photographs of them being used to fill a visual gap in unusual times, and becoming a part of the mainstream visual iconographies of this period. These creative responses by graffiti and street artists and everyday graffitists functioned as physical, tangible markers, giving a kind of visibility to the often invisible pandemic, and may have functioned as a way of safeguarding readers from a bombardment of literal representations of the horrors of the pandemic, whilst also visually marking the virus's presence. The memorial, one particularly notable example of COVID-19 graffiti is that of the National COVID-19 Memorial in London, which has been described as a place of unity, where losing someone this way has been very isolating for many different reasons. The wall is a reminder we aren't alone. They had names, families who loved them, stories to tell, and they will never just be a number. The wall reflects that. The memorial wall utilises mark-making for messages of personal remembrance and on a large scale to commemorate the UK victims of the COVID-19 virus. Its creation began in 2021 by the COVID-19 Bereaved Families for Justice UK and the activist group led by Donkeys, and was designed as a visual representation of the UK's catastrophic loss to COVID-19, and it stretches 500 metres along the River Thames and is found directly opposite the Houses of Parliament. As of March 2026, over 250,000 hearts have been painted on the wall, each representing a life lost in the UK to COVID-19. Visitors to the wall who've lost someone to the virus are invited to add a dedication in one of the hearts. The wall utilises graffiti to remember the scale of loss and personal devastation experienced in the UK during the pandemic. It's been described as a type of guerrilla memorial or grassroots memorial, created without the permission of the government or the wall's owner, thus embodying many of the anti-authoritarian views seen in other types of contemporary graffiti. And the Friends of the Wall have made it clear that they would like the site to be recognised and protected as a permanent record of suffering and grief. One volunteer has described how there's nobody else acknowledging the pain of COVID, as many individuals on the wall have no grave and were not able to have a funeral because of the restrictions of the time during the pandemic. Though modern graffiti is often understood through its intended ephemerality, the National COVID-19 Memorial utilises graffiti as a way of moving beyond the transitory nature of human experience and as a way to reflect on personal loss caused by a virus, whilst also forming an assemblage of national grief and remembrance. And despite contravening the Criminal Damage Act of 1971 and being a heritage crime as it was created on a listed structure, early organisers were aware that they would be arrested for creating graffiti. But their work has been largely accepted and supported by wider society, arguably due to the personal and shared emotional anguish that it embodies. So from this trans-historical approach, we can see that graffiti can be understood as archaeological artefacts which can inform our understandings and interpretations of both the recent and distant past. Alongside the archaeological value of the marks themselves, graffiti can also reflect shifting dynamics between people and places, including those caused by societal change or temporal disruptions, such as nationally or globally influential events, and those which take place slowly over time, as influenced by perceptions of public space and mark-making practices themselves. The use of graffiti to interpret periods of change can be seen in both the cell block graffiti at Richmond Castle and in the marks created during and in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. In both cases, mark makers externally express their internal thoughts, concerns and ideas onto their surrounding environments as a way of processing drastic alterations to their normal way of life caused by global upheaval. As discussed in this talk, graffiti can also reveal voices hidden from history and a variety of views in the present day, including those which challenge and reinforce hegemonic perspectives, meaning that graffiti archaeology can aid our understanding of both the past and the contemporary world. Graffiti is the environment's version of marginalia in books or manuscripts. Marks often operating at the margins of society or history, but graffiti archaeology can bring them to the fore. As just mentioned, as a mark of the everyday, graffiti can be used to challenge dominant hierarchies, both in the distant and more recent past. However, this accessibility also means that contemporary and some historic marks can be devalued due to the perception that anyone can make them. However, graffiti can function in a similar way to heritage, as it can help us to understand how different spaces are or are not valued. For example, graffiti archaeology can be used to reveal interstitial spaces, such as the underpasses of the Fallowfield Loop and the attic at Kirby Hall. Furthermore, when graffiti are understood as archaeological artefacts, such as those found within heritage settings, this can reveal how such marks can be understood as a type of heritage in themselves. For at least centuries and arguably millennia, individuals and groups have marked historic sites as mementos of their visits, and as a way of mark-making their presence. Consequently, graffiti functions as a type of heritage performance, as repeated gestures which subsequently become mementos mori, as they highlight the transient nature of life. And using a trans-historical perspective, we can see that graffiti in various periods, forms and spaces can be viewed as a way of communicating beyond oneself, and can be differentiated from other forms of writing as a way of externally communicating one's inner thoughts from the meaningful to the mundane onto the environment around us. And whilst graffiti can be a way of communicating with others, it can demonstrate a desire to be heard even if the communication is asynchronous or the reader is unknown or may never exist. Hundreds of graffiti could be found written onto the walls of the cell block by Richmond Castle by CEOs who left deeply personal messages, providing an insight into their thoughts, memories and beliefs during their detainments, inscribed onto the outside world for later occupants and posterity. The walls of the cell block function akin to a public or communal diary used by the CEOs to reaffirm their own beliefs, whilst also providing a way to express solidarity and camaraderie with subsequent detainees. Political critique, social statements, evidence of creativity, expressions of belief, the humorous and the mundane were all found intermingled amongst one another on the cell block's walls. So often oversimplified, graffiti has a long lineage as a traditional and everyday practice, but it's also paradoxical, with marks evoking both ephemerality and permanence, depending on a number of factors. Whilst modern graffiti is often understood as an ephemeral practice, subject to factors such as weather, local policies, quality, and subsequent interventions. For example, while some examples of COVID-19 mark making can still be found across public space, these are rare and largely serve as reminders of a past unprecedented period. They're echoes from a recent past which many are trying to move on from. However, graffiti can also embody a sense of permanence. The examination of graffiti within historic settings has shown that these marks are made across time and create a palimpsest of history. Studies of ancient graffiti demonstrate how such marks, under the right conditions, can stand the test of time across millennia. However, their survival depends on factors such as the conditions of the surface, their environment, human interaction, and I think probably most importantly, chance. While such marks can evoke a sense of permanence as records of voices from the past, others are innately ephemeral, either through intention or circumstance. When contemporary and historic graffiti are viewed together as a lineage of material, a graffiti paradox is revealed that graffiti can be both ephemeral and permanent. And even when graffiti do physically survive, partially or wholly, and the mark evokes a sense of permanency, the meaning of the mark can be ephemeral, as the fragments of information left behind are difficult to interpret or can be analysed in numerous ways. Furthermore, when a surface becomes home to a palimpsest of voices, the meaning of a singular piece of graffiti can also alter as it becomes part of a wider collection of marks. Consequently, the meaning of the mark also contains a certain ephemerality, as it fluctuates based on the changing context of its surroundings. Meanwhile, though some mark makers may have left graffiti within historic sites with the hope that these marks would signal as a record of their existence for posterity and intended as a permanent mark maker, the often inherent ephemeral nature of graffiti means that there's no guarantee that they will survive. Whilst graffiti may be a way of making internal thoughts and ideas physical within the landscape, the permanency or ephemerality of these marks is reliant on a world that is ever-changing.